The dust choked the air, clinging to sweat-slicked skin and parched throats. It rose in gritty clouds from the packed earth of the temporary square, kicked up by the shuffling feet of the crowd. Alara stood on the makeshift stage, a raw plank platform erected before the town's only saloon, feeling less like a person and more like an object discarded then put on gruesome display. The sun beat down, merciless, highlighting the crudity of her rough-spun dress and the stark paleness of her face. Fear was a physical weight in her chest, heavy and suffocating, making each breath a shallow, desperate thing. She tried to keep her gaze steady, focused on a point beyond the leering faces and speculative eyes, but they blurred into a monstrous, hungry entity. Whispers, coarse and cruel, drifted up to her like flies on carrion. She heard the words, orphan, destitute, no kin, property. The auctioneer, a man with a florid face and a voice like a bullhorn, bellowed his spiel, his words twisting her plight into a spectacle, her very existence reduced to a commodity, a potential helper, a breeder, a plaything. He listed her supposed attributes, inventing others, his descriptions crude and humiliating. Shame burned hotter than the sun on her cheeks. She wanted to cover her ears, to scream, to vanish. But she stood frozen, hands clenched at her sides, the last vestiges of her grandmother's teachings echoing faintly, "Stand tall, child, no matter the storm." But this storm felt unsurvivable. Her grandmother, gone. Her small, rented cabin, repossessed for debts she couldn't pay. Everything she had known swept away. And now this, sold, like cattle, or worse, like less than cattle, for cattle had value by their meat or milk. Her value was measured by her potential labor, her youth, her helplessness. The future stretched before her, a terrifying void. Would it be backbreaking labor in a stranger's kitchen, subjected to unknown cruelties? Or something far, far worse? Her stomach twisted with nausea. A man in the crowd spat, the sound loud in the sudden lull as the auctioneer paused for effect. Another laughed, a harsh, barking sound. She saw the glint in their eyes, the assessment. It stripped her bare, leaving her feeling exposed and utterly vulnerable. This dusty, lawless outpost at the edge of civilization felt like the end of the world, and she was its sacrificial lamb. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But where? There was nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The empty vastness of the plains offered no refuge for a woman alone. She was trapped, caught in a net of desperation and circumstance, and the auctioneer's hammer was poised to seal her fate. The air thrummed with anticipation, a sickening energy. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, picturing the kind lines of her grandmother's face, trying to draw strength from memory, but the image was fractured by the harsh reality of her surroundings. When she opened them, the faces were still there, waiting, judging, eager. The auctioneer cleared his throat, ready to begin the bidding. The first bid would be the sound that shattered her last fragile hold on independence, on her own will. It would mark her transition from a person with a name to a possession with a price. A whimper escaped her lips, silent, lost in the noise of the crowd. She was alone, and the world was a harsh, unforgiving place ready to consume her. The wood beneath her bare feet felt rough, splintered. She could feel the eyes on her, burning into her skin. They were appraising her like an animal, checking teeth, assessing strength, estimating compliance. She straightened her shoulders fractionally, a small, defiant act in the face of utter subjugation. Changed nothing, but it was all she had. The sun beat down. The dust rose. The auctioneer took a deep breath, ready to unleash the first call for bids. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. The moment her life ceased to be her own. The man in the front row, burly with a thick beard, leaned forward, a calculating look in his eyes. He seemed the most eager. Would he be the one? What horrors awaited her under his roof? The possibilities were endless, and each one painted a fresh stroke of terror onto the canvas of her mind. She bit her lip, tasting copper. She would not cry, not here, not in front of them. Let them have her body, her labor, but they would not break her spirit entirely. This resolve, fragile as spun glass, was her only shield. The auctioneer raised his hammer. The auctioneer, a man named Jedediah, known for his booming voice and lack of scruple, launched into his opening remarks. "All right, folks, gather round. Got a valuable asset here today. Young woman, strong build." He gestured vaguely towards Alara, avoiding her eyes as he would avoid stepping in something unpleasant. "Good health from what we can tell. Orphaned, no ties, no debts but her own, which the town has seen fit to cover temporarily." Now, we're not talking about indentured servitude in the usual sense, no, not exactly. More of a placement. For her own good, naturally. The buyer will be responsible for her upkeep, her lodging, her board, and her labor, as agreed upon. He punctuated the word agreed upon with a wink towards the crowd, which elicited a few lewd chuckles. Alara flinched internally, her face betraying nothing. Her labor, that was the euphemism. Her life, her time, her body, subject to the whims of whoever paid the highest price. Jedediah cleared his throat noisily. "She's young, capable, willing to work, I'm told." Another lie, a cruel assumption born of her helplessness. She wasn't willing, she was forced. Could be a hand around the house, help with chores, maybe even learn a trade. Potential is considerable. He grinned, showing a few missing teeth. "Now we'll start the bidding low, see where it goes. Let's say $10. $10 for this opportunity." A few hesitant murmurs rippled through the crowd, followed by a voice from the back. 12. 12, we have 12. Going for 12. Any advance on 12? Jedediah cried, his voice gaining momentum. 15. A woman's voice this time, sharp and demanding. Alara risked a glance. A stern-faced woman in a dark dress, proprietor of the town's laundry and notorious for working her girls to the bone. Fear intensified. Laundry work was backbreaking, but the woman's reputation for cruelty was even more daunting. 15. We have 15. Going for 15. 20. The bearded man from the front, his voice gruff and impatient. 20.
$20.
The gentleman here bids 20. A fine offer. Jedediah's eyes gleamed, sensing the price rising. Any more? Any more for this able-bodied young woman? 25. Another man, older, with rheumy eyes that lingered on Alara too long. A wave of revulsion washed over her. 25. Going for 25. 30. The stern woman again, her jaw set. 30.
$30.
Any more interest? The bidding climbed slowly, incrementally. Each number called out felt like a nail hammered into her coffin. 35. 40. 45. 50. The air grew thicker, heavier with the weight of their assessments.
$50.
Her worth in their eyes. It was nothing. Less than a good horse. Less than a decent rifle. She felt a profound, aching loneliness. Was there no one who saw her as more than this? As a human being caught in a terrible situation. The bidding stalled at $60, the bid coming from the bearded man again, his voice final, confident. Jedediah waited, scanning the crowd.
$60.
Going for 60. 60. Any advance? Last chance. He held the hammer high, ready to bring it down. Alara braced herself, her eyes fixed on the hammer, on the impending doom. The bearded man grinned, a look of triumph on his face. He seemed sure he had won. The stern woman frowned, shaking her head slightly. It seemed it was decided. Then, a voice cut through the noise, deep and resonant, from the edge of the crowd. It wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that silenced Jedediah mid-swing and drew every eye. 100. Alara's head snapped towards the sound. The crowd parted slightly, revealing a figure who had been standing slightly apart, observing in silence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in practical, well-made clothes that spoke of substance, not flash. His face was lean, weathered with sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to take everything in without betraying any thought. A dark hat was pulled low, shadowing his features slightly, but Alara could see the strong line of his jaw, the quiet intensity of his gaze. He wasn't one of the dusty, rough men she had seen leering. There was a stillness about him, a sense of quiet power that set him apart. He looked different. He looked like he belonged to the land itself, vast and unyielding. He was known in these parts, though rarely seen in town, Silas Blackwood, the cattle baron who owned thousands of acres to the west, a solitary, formidable figure who kept to himself. Why would he be here? And why would he bid? Jedediah blinked, momentarily stunned. 100? Did I hear that right? Mr. Blackwood. Silas Blackwood nodded curtly, his gaze still fixed on Alara. She couldn't read his expression. It wasn't lust or cruelty she saw there, but something unreadable, perhaps pity, perhaps simple calculation, but it lacked the ugliness she had seen in others' eyes. It unsettled her in a different way. The crowd murmured, surprised. $100 was a considerable sum for this. The bearded man glared at Blackwood, clearly annoyed. $100. Jedediah recovered his composure, his voice even louder now, laced with excitement. We have $100. From Mr. Blackwood. Any advance on 100? Silence fell over the square, heavy and absolute. No one dared challenge Silas Blackwood. His wealth was vast, his reputation formidable, his nature mysterious. The previous bidders shifted uncomfortably, defeated. The stern woman pursed her lips. The bearded man grumbled something under his breath. Jedediah grinned, a wide, avaricious display. Going once, going twice. Sold. To Mr. Silas Blackwood for $100. The hammer came down with a sharp, decisive crack. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. Alara's knees buckled slightly. It was done. She had been sold. But not to the leering men or the cruel woman. She belonged now to the silent, imposing figure at the edge of the crowd. It wasn't freedom, but it was different. Was this better? Or was the unknown fate he offered more terrifying than the one she could imagine? His eyes still held hers, unwavering. She felt a tremor run through her, a mix of fear and a strange, tentative flicker of what? Hope? Or just the shock of the unexpected? Her future rested entirely in the hands of a man she had never spoken to, a man known only by his silence and his land. Jedediah bustled towards Silas Blackwood, eager to collect his fee. Blackwood reached into his coat pocket, produced a thick roll of bills, and peeled off several, handing them over without a word. His attention, however, remained on Alara. He didn't smile, didn't frown. His expression was unreadable, like the vast, empty plains he called home. The crowd began to disperse, the spectacle over. As people filed past, some cast curious or resentful glances at Alara and Blackwood. She felt a new kind of exposure bought by the most powerful man in the territory, a subject of gossip and speculation. This notoriety, while perhaps offering a strange form of protection, also felt isolating. She was marked now. Jedediah, counting the money quickly, then turned to Alara. Well, girl, you belong to him now. Mr. Blackwood. He gestured towards Silas with a jerk of his head, suddenly losing his earlier obsequiousness now that the money was in hand. Go on, get down. Alara hesitated, her legs feeling shaky. Getting down meant walking towards him, towards the unknown. She descended the steps slowly, her bare feet meeting the dusty ground. The grit felt rough beneath her soles. She stood a few feet from Silas Blackwood, not daring to approach closer, her eyes fixed on her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He didn't move, didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, observing her with that same unreadable gaze. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. What was he thinking? Was he regretting his purchase? Did he expect her to grovel, to thank him? The thought of thanking him for buying her like livestock was repugnant. Finally, his voice broke the silence. It was quiet, low, and devoid of emotion, yet it held a distinct timbre of command. You got a name, it wasn't a question. Alara, she managed, her voice barely a whisper, hoarse from dust and fear. Ilara, he repeated it, tasting the sound, his eyes still on her face. All right, Ilara. You'll come with me. He didn't offer a hand, didn't make a welcoming gesture. It was a simple statement of fact, a directive. He turned, then, and began walking towards where horses were tethered nearby. Ilara stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his words settling on her. She was to simply follow, like a dog. With a deep breath, she forced herself to move. Her legs felt stiff and used. She followed him, keeping a respectful distance, her eyes fixed on his broad back. He walked with a steady, unhurried stride, a man comfortable in his own skin and in command of his surroundings. He reached a large, powerful-looking horse tied alongside a sturdy pack mule. He unhitched the mule first, checking its saddlebags with practiced efficiency. He seemed to ignore her presence entirely now, focused on the task. This indifference was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. Was she just another piece of property to be transported? He finished with the mule and turned to his horse, a magnificent bay gelding. He swung himself into the saddle with effortless grace. From his height, he looked even more imposing. He looked down at her, his gaze still impassive. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice flat. Ilara nodded, finding her voice a little stronger. "Yes, sir. My grandfather taught me." He seemed to consider this for a moment. "There's an extra saddle on the mule. Can you manage?" "Yes, sir," she replied. The prospect of riding, of covering distance, offered a small, unexpected comfort. Movement felt less confining than standing still, waiting. He didn't elaborate. He simply nudged his horse forward a few steps, leading the mule. It was clear she was expected to saddle the mule herself and follow. There was no offer of help, no concession for her ordeal. It was practical, direct, and perhaps, in its own way, less humiliating than forced pleasantries would have been. She walked towards the mule, her heart a chaotic mix of apprehension, exhaustion, and a sliver of bewildered curiosity about the man who now owned her. The journey west, into his vast, silent territory, had begun. She approached the mule cautiously. It was a sturdy animal, its eyes calm. The saddle was already on its back, just needing to be adjusted and cinched. Her hands, though trembling slightly from the day's ordeal, still remembered the familiar motions. She checked the stirrups, tightened the girth, her movements automatic, learned long ago on her grandfather's small farm. The leather felt rough and familiar under her fingers. Mounting the mule was easier than she expected. She settled into the saddle, the slight swaying motion of the animal beneath her surprisingly comforting after the static dread of the auction block. Silas Blackwood was already moving away from the town, a dark, solitary figure on his bay horse, leading the mule. He didn't look back to see if she followed. It was assumed. She nudged the mule gently with her heels, urging it into a walk to keep pace with him. The town receded behind them, its crude buildings and dust-choked square shrinking against the vast backdrop of the plains. The air outside the town felt cleaner, though still warm and dry. The landscape opened up, stretching out in endless waves of sun-bleached grass, broken only by distant, hazy mesas on the horizon. The silence out here was profound, broken only by the rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. It was a silence that felt both isolating and strangely peaceful, a stark contrast to the clamoring noise of the town. They rode for hours under the relentless sun. Blackwood rode ahead, never speaking, rarely even looking back. Ilara followed, her body aching from the tension and the unfamiliar rhythm of riding after so long. Her mind, freed from the immediate threat of the auction, began to churn. Why had he bought her? $100 was a significant sum, especially given the paltry bids from the others. He didn't seem like a man who wasted money. What did he want with her? A worker, yes, that much was clear. But for a man with vast lands and, presumably, hired hands, buying a lone woman at auction seemed an unusual choice. Was there more to it? Or was it a simple act of practicality, seeing a need and acquiring a solution? His silence was unnerving. She tried to study him from behind, observing his posture, the way he handled his horse, looking for any clue to his character. He sat tall in the saddle, relaxed yet alert, his movements economical and purposeful. He seemed entirely at ease in this vast, empty landscape. It was his domain. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, they finally stopped by a small creek. Blackwood dismounted, his movements fluid and unhurried. He led the horses to the water, letting them drink. Alara dismounted clumsily, her legs stiff and sore. She walked to the creek bank, knelt, and cupped her hands, drinking the cool, clear water. It was the first clean water she had tasted in days, a simple luxury that brought a small measure of relief. Blackwood watched her for a moment before turning to the pack mule. He began to unpack supplies, a small tent, bedrolls, a portable stove, coffee pot, dried food. He worked efficiently, setting up camp with practiced ease. He didn't ask for her help, didn't offer instructions. Again, she was left to observe, uncertain of her role. Should she offer? Would it be welcome or seen as overstepping? She decided silence and observation were the safest course. She watched him build a small fire, the flames flickering to life in the twilight. The smell of wood smoke was comforting, evoking distant memories of her grandmother's hearth. He boiled coffee, the rich aroma filling the air. He poured a cup for himself, then, without a word, poured another and set it on a flat rock near where she stood. It was a small gesture, understated, but it felt significant. He wasn't ignoring her entirely. He was providing. She walked over and picked up the metal cup, its warmth seeping into her cold hands. She sipped the coffee. It was strong and bitter, but welcome. He ate his meal of jerky and hardtack in silence, sitting by the fire, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon. He offered her some, pushing the bag of jerky towards her with a silent nod. She took a piece, chewing the tough meat slowly. It wasn't much, but it was sustenance. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire, the soft snorts of the horses, and the vast, breathing quiet of the plains around them. As darkness fully enveloped them, he spoke again, his voice low in the quiet night. "You can take the tent. I'll sleep by the fire." Another directive, simple and direct. He wasn't asking if she wanted it, he was assigning it. It was a practical arrangement, offering her a measure of privacy and shelter. There was no expectation, no hint of anything untoward in his tone or manner. It was just provision. She felt a knot of tension she hadn't realized was there begin to loosen in her chest. Perhaps this was all it was, a transaction, a purchase of labor and presence for sustenance and shelter. It wasn't kindness, not exactly, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was something else, something she hadn't anticipated. She murmured a quiet thank you, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the fire. She retreated towards the small tent he had erected, leaving him alone in the firelight. The tent offered a small, enclosed space, a flimsy barrier against the vastness of the night. Inside, he had laid out a bedroll. She sank onto it, the soft wool a relief to her weary body. Lying there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the night and the distant presence of the man who owned her, her mind replayed the day. The humiliation of the auction, the shock of Blackwood's bid, the long, silent ride. She was still afraid, still uncertain, but the edge of sheer terror had dulled. He hadn't hurt her, hadn't threatened her, hadn't even looked at her with the predatory hunger she had come to expect. He was quiet, distant, but correct. He had provided water, food, shelter. Basic needs met without fuss or expectation of gratitude. It was a strange form of security, one based on a transaction rather than any human connection. She didn't understand him, not at all. But for tonight, she was safe from the wolves of the town. And that, in itself, felt like a fragile miracle. She closed her eyes, the vast silence of the prairie holding her in its indifferent embrace. Over the next few days, they continued the journey west. The pattern remained the same. Blackwood rode ahead in silence, Alara followed on the mule. They stopped to make camp at dusk. He would provide food and coffee. She would sleep in the tent, and he would sleep by the fire. Dialogue was minimal, limited to essential questions like, "Need water?" or simple instructions. He didn't pry into her past, didn't ask about her life before the auction. She didn't ask about his. A vast, unspoken territory existed between them, as wide and empty as the land they traversed. Alara spent the long hours in the saddle observing him. She noticed the way he read the landscape, the subtle signs of weather, the tracks of animals. He moved with an innate understanding of this wild country. He was a part of it, not just a visitor. She saw the quiet competence in everything he did, from saddling a horse to building a fire in wind. He was self-reliant, capable, and seemingly content in his solitude. This observation chipped away at her initial fear, replacing it with a grudging respect. He was not like the men in town. He was harsh, yes, but the harshness seemed directed outwards, towards the elements and the challenges of the land, not inwards towards people. She also began to notice small things. One evening, when a chill wind picked up, he added extra wood to the fire and repositioned the tent entrance without a word. Another time, he pointed out a rare wildflower growing near their camp. These were tiny gestures, easily missed, but to Alara, isolated and vulnerable, they felt significant. They were not acts of warmth or affection, but they were acts of quiet consideration. He didn't have to do them. He had bought her labor, not her comfort or safety beyond the basic necessity to keep her alive and able to work. These small acts hinted at something beneath the stoic exterior, a flicker of something. She didn't dare name it. As they rode deeper into Blackwood's territory, the landscape changed subtly. The grass grew taller, the rolling hills became more pronounced, and distant mountains began to dominate the western horizon, their peaks dusted with white. The air felt drier, thinner. After nearly a week of travel, they reached the heart of his ranch lands. It wasn't a sprawling complex like some she had heard of. His home was a sturdy, single-story house built of logs and stone, nestled in a wide valley sheltered by hills. It looked functional, built for endurance rather than show. There were corrals, a barn, and a few smaller outbuildings scattered nearby. A wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. As they approached, a few figures emerged from the barn, men in working clothes, hands wiping on their pants, hats pushed back. They stopped what they were doing and watched their arrival, their expressions curious but respectful. They were Blackwood's ranch hands, a small crew. Blackwood dismounted as they reached the house, handing the reins of his horse to one of the men. He gave a few quiet instructions she couldn't hear. The men nodded and led the horses away. Blackwood turned to Alara, who had dismounted stiffly from the mule. He finally addressed her directly, his voice low and level. "This is the house. It's not fancy. It's sturdy," she offered. The first conversation of more than a few words they'd had since the auction block. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging her observation. "Inside, it's basic. You'll have a room. A room. Not a corner of the kitchen floor, not a cot in a drafty barn. A room." The unexpected provision took her by surprise. It wasn't large, he explained as he led her inside, but it was hers. It was simple, containing only a narrow bed, a small chest of drawers, and a chair. But it had a door that closed, a window that looked out onto the valley, and a sense of privacy that was almost overwhelming after the past weeks of exposure and uncertainty. The main part of the house was functional and Spartan, a large kitchen that served as the main living space, a table big enough to feed several men, a large fireplace. A few other rooms led off from this central area. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and dried herbs. "The men eat here," Blackwood said, gesturing to the table. "They work the range. They'll be in at night," he paused. "Your duties will be here. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, keeping the house. It's work." His bluntness was almost refreshing. He wasn't sugarcoating it. It was work, hard work likely, but it was clearly defined. It wasn't the terrifying ambiguity of the auction square. "I understand," she said quietly. I can do that. She had helped her grandmother with similar tasks, albeit on a much smaller scale. Good, he seemed satisfied. He didn't offer further explanation of the house, the men, or his expectations. He simply showed her where things were: the pantry, the water pump outside, the woodpile. It was a practical tour of her new domain of labor. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the ranch hands began to filter in. They were rough-looking men, weathered and worn by the elements, but they greeted Blackwood with respect. They glanced at Alara with open curiosity, but their gazes lacked the predatory edge of the townspeople. They seemed decent in the way men who live and work together in isolation often are. Blackwood introduced her simply as Alara, who'll be helping in the house. Her status wasn't explicitly stated as bought woman, but it was clear she wasn't a hired hand. Yet, the men treated her with a sort of quiet courtesy, nodding greetings, their questions directed at Blackwood, not her. That first night, she cooked dinner for the men, simple fare of beans, salt pork, and biscuits using the supplies Blackwood indicated. Her hands, stiff from riding, found their rhythm in the familiar tasks. As she worked by the large fireplace, she could feel Blackwood's presence nearby, sometimes sitting at the table cleaning a rifle, sometimes just observing. He didn't interfere, didn't give instructions, just let her work. It was a strange dynamic, this unspoken agreement. She was there to work, he was there to oversee, and the men were there to be fed and housed. As they ate, the men talked amongst themselves about the day's ride, the cattle, the weather. Blackwood mostly listened, occasionally interjecting a quiet question or comment. He wasn't a man of many words, even with his own crew. Alara listened too, absorbing the rhythm of their lives, the language of the ranch. It was a world utterly foreign to her, but one she would now inhabit. After dinner, the men dispersed, some to a small bunkhouse, others to their own rooms in the main house. Alara began the task of cleaning up. Blackwood remained by the fire, smoking a pipe, the scent mingling with the lingering smells of food. When she finished, wiping down the last surface, she hesitated. Should she ask what else needed doing, or simply retreat to her room? She decided on the latter. It felt safer to wait for instruction than to guess. "You can turn in," Blackwood said without looking at her, as if reading her thoughts. "Sun's up early out here." "Yes, sir," she replied, the formality feeling necessary. She walked towards the back of the house, towards her room. As she reached the door, she paused. She looked back at him, silhouetted against the dying firelight. He was a mystery, a man who had bought her freedom from one kind of prison only to bring her to another, albeit a seemingly less cruel one. But was it prison? Or was it simply a life? She didn't know yet. She entered her small room and closed the door softly behind her. Felt like a sanctuary. She sat on the edge of the bed, the wool of the bedroll soft beneath her. The silence of the room was profound after the muted activity of the kitchen. She looked out the window at the dark shape of the hills against the star-filled sky. The stars out here were impossibly bright, a million pinpricks of light in the inky blackness. They seemed closer, more numerous than she had ever seen them. It was a beautiful, overwhelming sight, a vastness that mirrored the vastness of the land and the vastness of her uncertainty. She was here now, on Blackwood's land, under his roof, bound to him by $100 and the laws of a world that saw her as property. It was not the life she would have chosen, but it was a life. And for the first time since her grandmother died, she felt a fragile sense of safety bought and paid for. She lay back on the bed, fully clothed, too weary to undress. Sleep came quickly, a heavy, dreamless respite. Life on the Blackwood Ranch settled into a rhythm, a predictable cycle dictated by the sun and the needs of the cattle and the men who tended them. Alara's days were filled with work. She woke before dawn, started the fire, prepared coffee, and cooked breakfast for the ranch hands. There were dishes to wash, floors to sweep, laundry to boil and scrub in large metal tubs outside. She kneaded dough for bread, tended a small vegetable patch near the house, patched clothes. The work was hard, monotonous, and physically demanding, but it was honest labor, and it filled the long hours, leaving her little time to dwell on her circumstances or the past. She rarely interacted directly with the ranch hands beyond serving meals. They were polite but distant, respecting the unspoken boundaries of the house and her position within it. They called her Miss Alara, a small courtesy that she appreciated. Their presence, while sometimes noisy and rough, was not threatening. They seemed a decent lot, bound together by their shared work and reliance on Blackwood. Silas Blackwood remained a quiet, enigmatic presence. He was often out on the range, sometimes for days at a time. When he was at the house, he spent his time managing the ranch affairs, cleaning equipment, or simply sitting by the fire, reading or staring into the flames, lost in thought. He never intruded on her space, never demanded anything beyond the work she was there to do. He was observant, however. She would sometimes catch him watching her as she worked, his gaze steady and unreadable. It wasn't a discomforting stare, merely an assessment, as if he were evaluating the efficiency of her labor, or perhaps something more. She couldn't tell. He continued the small, quiet gestures of provision. If she was struggling with a heavy load of firewood, he might appear and lift it for her without a word. If she needed a tool, it would sometimes appear near where she was working, placed there silently when her back was turned. He didn't offer praise or criticism, just the necessary resources or occasional, unsolicited assistance. It was a functional relationship, built on necessity and quiet observation, not conversation or shared feeling. Alara, in turn, observed him. She noticed the lines of fatigue around his eyes after a long ride, the calluses on his hands, the quick, decisive way he moved when something needed doing. She saw how his men respected him, not out of fear, but out of loyalty and trust in his judgment. He was fair, demanding but just. She learned that he had built the ranch himself from nothing in this remote corner of the territory. His solitude seemed less like loneliness and more like a deliberate choice, a preference for the company of the land over that of most people. One afternoon, while she was hanging laundry on a line behind the house, a sudden, fierce gust of wind whipped through the valley. It tore the sheets from the line, sending them swirling like ghosts across the ground. Alara lunged to catch them, but the wind was too strong. Before she could chase after them, Blackwood emerged from the barn, where he had been working. He saw what was happening, his gaze sharp. Without a word, he began moving, not running frantically like she was, but moving with a long, ground-eating stride, anticipating where the wind would carry the fabric. He cornered one sheet near the corral, expertly snagged another from a tumbleweed, and managed to retrieve most of them before they were lost entirely. He gathered the armload of fabric and brought it back to her, his face impassive, though his hat was pulled low against the wind. He didn't say, "Be more careful," or "What are you doing?" He simply handed her the bundle of laundry. "Wind comes fast out here," he stated, a simple fact, not a reprimand. "Thank you," she said, genuinely grateful. Losing the sheets would have been a significant problem. He gave that small, almost imperceptible nod again. "Secure them better," again, a simple, practical instruction. He watched for a moment as she used extra clothespins, securing the remaining items more firmly. Then he turned and went back to the barn. It was a small incident, but it stayed with her. He hadn't scolded her helplessness. He had simply acted, then offered practical advice. It was his way. Actions spoke louder than words, and his actions, though not warm, were consistently reliable, providing and protecting in a quiet, competent manner. Her fear of him had dissipated entirely, replaced by this wary respect. She was still his property, yes, the reality of the auction was a weight she carried, but he was not a cruel master. He was simply Blackwood, and in this harsh, unpredictable world, his quiet strength and reliability felt, unexpectedly, like a form of shelter. One evening, a rider appeared on the horizon just before dusk. He rode hard, dust trailing behind him. Alara, working in the kitchen, saw Blackwood step out onto the porch, his body language alert. The rider reached the house, swung down from his horse, and spoke to Blackwood in low, urgent tones. Alara couldn't hear the words, but she saw the ranch hands emerge from the bunkhouse, their faces grim as they listened. The air thickened with tension. Blackwood turned and walked back into the house. His face was set, his eyes hard. He went directly to a gun rack by the fireplace and took down a rifle, checking its action. "Rustlers," he stated, his voice flat and Karlar-like. "Hit the south herd. Took a good number." Rustlers. The word sent a chill down Alara's spine. She knew of them, desperate, violent men who preyed on the vulnerability of isolated ranchers. "The men are riding out," Blackwood said, pulling on a heavy coat. "Chase the herd. Maybe catch the thieves." He turned to Alara, his gaze sharp. "You stay in the house. Lock the doors and windows after we leave. Don't open for anyone." His tone was not a suggestion, but an order. His concern, though expressed in his usual terse manner, was clear. He wasn't leaving her unprotected. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice a little shaky. He paused at the door, rifle in hand. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met hers. There was something in them she hadn't seen before, not just resolve, but a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even concern. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Be back when we can," he said, then turned and strode out into the gathering darkness. Alara watched from the window as Blackwood and his men rode out, a small, determined group swallowed by the night. The sound of their horses' hooves faded, leaving an unnerving silence. The house, usually bustling with activity in the evenings, felt empty and vulnerable. She did as he instructed, going through the house and securing every door and window, her hands trembling slightly. The silence outside was no longer peaceful, but menacing. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind against the walls, sounded like an intruder. She spent the night huddled by the fireplace, a lamp casting flickering shadows. Sleep was impossible. Her mind conjured images of the rustlers, of violent, desperate men. What if they weren't caught? What if they decided to return to the ranch house? Blackwood had told her not to open the door for anyone. But what could she do against armed men? Fear, cold and sharp, had returned, reminding her of her fundamental vulnerability. She was a woman alone in a remote house, dependent on the protection of men who were now gone. As the hours dragged on, the silence outside seemed to deepen. She listened intently, straining to hear anything over the pounding of her own heart. The lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on her eyes. She thought of the men out there in the dark, facing danger. She thought of Blackwood, his quiet strength, his unexpected protection. Towards dawn, just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, she heard sounds. Not the wind, not the settling of the house, but something deliberate. Hooves, coming closer. Her heart leaped into her throat. Were they Blackwood and his men, returning? Or were they the rustlers? She crept to a window, peering cautiously through a gap in the curtains. Shapes emerged from the pre-dawn gloom. Horses, riders. As they drew closer, she could make out the familiar forms of Blackwood and his men. Relief washed over her so powerfully her legs almost gave out. They were back. She waited by the door, not opening it until she heard Blackwood's voice outside, sharp and weary. She unbolted it, pulling it open. Blackwood stood there, covered in dust, his face drawn with fatigue. The men behind him looked equally exhausted. They had recovered some of the herd, he said, but the rustlers had escaped into the Badlands. He stepped inside, lowering his rifle. His eyes found hers, and this time, the look was clearer relief, perhaps, or just the weariness of a man who had been tested. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice trembling slightly from the spent fear. "I did as you said. Kept the doors locked." He nodded. "Good." He looked around the quiet house. "The men will need food. Coffee." "Yes, sir," she said, already moving towards the kitchen, her fear now replaced by a surge of purpose. There was work to be done. She was needed. While she worked, starting the fire, brewing coffee, and preparing a meal from what was available, The men came in, their movements stiff with exhaustion. They talked sparingly, detailing the chase, the lost cattle, the frustrating escape of the rustlers. Blackwood sat at the table, listening, occasionally rubbing a hand across his tired face. He looked less like an imposing baron and more like a man burdened by the weight of his responsibilities. As she set plates of food before them, one of the men, a grizzled older cowboy named Hank, looked at Alara. "Must have been a long night for you in here, Miss Alara. Hearin' things in the dark." Alara met his gaze. "It was quiet," she said, understatement her only defense. "But I kept the doors locked." Hank nodded slowly, a look of understanding in his eyes. "That's something." Blackwood, who had been silent, looked up then, meeting Alara's eyes. His gaze was steady. He didn't speak, but in that moment, something shifted between them. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of shared vulnerability, a mutual recognition of the quiet courage required to face down fear, whether out on the range or alone in a dark house. The rigid barrier between master and bought woman seemed to soften, replaced by a shared experience, a mutual reliance. He needed the house kept and the men fed. She needed the security and protection his ranch provided. It was a partnership forged in necessity and tempered by hardship. In the days that followed the rustler attack, a subtle change permeated the atmosphere of the ranch. Alara felt less like a temporary fixture and more like an integral part of the household. The men treated her with increased respect, their earlier curiosity replaced by a quiet camaraderie. They shared stories of the range with her while she served meals, asked about her small garden plot, included her in the small rituals of ranch life. Silas Blackwood's interactions remained sparse, but the quality of his silence seemed to shift. The unreadable gaze now held a different weight. He still didn't offer explanations or apologies for her presence here, but the quiet provision of small comforts continued, sometimes more noticeable now. He ensured there was always enough wood for her fire, that the roof over her room was sound, that she had proper boots for working outside when winter approached. He wasn't buying her affection. He was providing for the well-being of someone under his care, someone who had proven reliable and resilient. One afternoon, Alara was struggling to repair a broken fence near the house, trying to hammer nails with an unwieldy tool. Blackwood was nearby, mending tack. He watched her for a minute, his usual silent observation. Then, without a word, he rose, walked over, and took the hammer from her hand. He replaced it with his own, a smaller, balanced tool, better suited to her hand. "Use this," he said, his voice low. He didn't do the work for her, didn't offer extensive instruction, but showed her a better way to hold the nail, a steadier swing. He worked alongside her for a few minutes, not talking, just sharing the task, his presence a quiet anchor. It wasn't about proving her inadequacy. It was about enabling her competence. He stood back then, letting her continue on her own. "Gets easier with the right tool," he commented. A rare instance of offering unsolicited advice that wasn't an instruction. "Thank you, sir," she replied, the words coming naturally now, a sign of genuine gratitude rather than forced deference. He nodded, a fractional dip of his head. He picked up his tack and returned to his work, but the shared moment lingered in the air between them. Alara spent her evenings reading by the fire, poring over the few books Blackwood kept on a dusty shelf, mostly practical guides on ranching, but also a worn copy of Shakespeare and a collection of poetry. She discovered that he, too, sometimes read in the evenings, though more often he would sit and smoke his pipe, staring into the flames, his thoughts a private country she couldn't access. Her internal landscape had changed dramatically since the auction. The despair and terror had receded, replaced by a quiet determination and a sense of purpose. She was no longer waiting for a terrible fate. She was building a life, piece by piece, with her own hands. The work was hard, but it grounded her. The predictable routine provided a sense of security she hadn't realized she craved. She had found refuge not in the arms of a savior, but in the functional, demanding reality of a working ranch and the quiet, reliable presence of its owner. She understood now that Blackwood hadn't bought her out of charity or desire, but perhaps out of a complex mixture of pragmatic need and a silent, deeply buried sense of justice. He had seen a soul about to be crushed by the ugliness of men, and he had intervened, not with a fanfare of heroism, but with a simple transaction that redirected her fate towards a different, more solitary form of existence. He had given her a chance, a place, and in return, she provided order and care in his Spartan home, allowing him to focus on the vast, demanding world of his ranch. One cold evening, with snow beginning to dust the peaks of the distant mountains, Alara sat mending one of Blackwood's shirts by the fire. He was seated nearby, cleaning his rifle. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the scrape of metal on metal, and the soft hum of Alara's needle pulling thread through fabric. He broke the silence, his voice low. "You handle yourself well." Alara paused, surprised by the unprompted observation. "The work needs doing," she replied simply, not wanting to appear as if she sought praise. He nodded slowly, his gaze on the rifle. "Many would complain. Or break." "Breaking doesn't change anything," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was a truth she had learned the hard way. He finally looked up, meeting her eyes across the hearth. The firelight softened the lines on his face, revealing a depth she rarely glimpsed. "No," he agreed, his voice thoughtful. "It doesn't." In that brief exchange, more was said than in all the weeks of silence. He saw her strength, her resilience, not just her labor. And she saw a flicker of something in him, recognition, perhaps, or a shared understanding of the harsh realities of survival. She was no longer the terrified girl on the auction block. The journey through fear and uncertainty had forged something new within her, a quiet confidence, a deep-seated resilience. She was still bound to Blackwood, yes, their relationship defined by the circumstances of her arrival. But it was a bond that had evolved, shifting from ownership and desperation to one of mutual, if unspoken, respect. She had found her footing in this wild, solitary place, not as a prisoner, but as a capable woman who had traded one form of hardship for another, and in doing so had found a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to simply endure, to work, and to rebuild a sense of self in a world that had tried to strip it away. The vast, indifferent sky outside her window no longer felt like a symbol of her isolation, but of the endless possibility of the horizon. Her future remained uncertain, but it was no longer a source of terror. It was a path she would walk, head held high, on her own 2 feet, on land that was not hers, but where she had, against all odds, found a place to stand. The world outside the Blackwood Ranch continued its relentless turning, bringing changing seasons and new challenges. Winter descended, blanketing the land in snow and isolating them further. The work shifted, chopping wood, tending the stoves, preparing hearty, warm meals, mending and maintaining equipment indoors. Alara found a quiet satisfaction in the rhythm of the cold months, the shared necessity of keeping the house warm and functional against the biting wind. Her small room, heated by the kitchen stove pipe that ran through it, became a sanctuary of warmth and solitude. She continued her quiet observations of Silas Blackwood. The winter months, keeping him closer to the house, allowed her to see more of his nature. He spent hours poring over ledger books, managing the complex logistics of his operation from afar. He was a man of sharp intelligence, his mind constantly working. He treated his men fairly, ensuring they had warm gear, sufficient food, and a safe place to weather the storms. His responsibility for the lives and livelihoods dependent on him was a tangible weight he carried with quiet fortitude. Their conversations remained infrequent and centered on practical matters. "Snow's deep, the south fence will be buried. Need more flour from town when the road's clear." But there were moments that transcended the purely functional. One evening, a fierce blizzard raged outside, rattling the windows and howling down the chimney. The men were tense, worried about the cattle out on the range. Blackwood sat by the fire, seemingly calm, sharpening a knife. He spoke then, not to anyone in particular, but to the room, his voice steady above the storm. He told a brief, understated story of a past winter, a hardship faced and overcome. It wasn't a dramatic tale, but a simple account of endurance and resourcefulness. It settled the men's nerves and offered Alara a glimpse into the deep well of experience and resilience that lay beneath his quiet exterior. Her own resilience grew, tested and strengthened by the demands of ranch life. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. Her body, once weary and fearful, grew lean and capable. She could lift heavy buckets of water, swing an axe with surprising power, work for hours without complaint. The physical labor was a form of meditation, clearing her mind and building a strength that was more than just muscle. It was a strength of will, a refusal to be broken. The isolation of the ranch, while sometimes lonely, also offered a sense of peace she hadn't known before. There were no judging eyes, no cruel whispers, no one who knew her past or her circumstances before the auction. She was simply Alara, the woman who kept the Blackwood house running. It was a simpler identity, earned through honest work and quiet perseverance. As winter began to loosen its grip, the days grew longer, and the first hints of spring appeared on the horizon. The ranch prepared for the spring roundup, a period of intense activity. More men were hired, the atmosphere became busier, more focused. Alara's work increased, feeding the larger crew, preparing for the long days the men would spend in the saddle. During this time, a traveling salesman, a garrulous man with a wagon full of goods, made his way to the ranch. He brought supplies, mail, and news from the outside world, including the town where Alara had been sold. As Alara unpacked some of the supplies he brought, she overheard the salesman talking to Blackwood near the barn. The man mentioned the auction, asking Blackwood, with a nudge and a wink, about the girl he'd bought. Alara froze, her heart pounding. The man's tone was crude, suggestive, the same kind of talk she had endured in the town square. Blackwood's response was immediate and sharp. Alara couldn't hear the exact words, but his voice was low and color-edged. The salesman's jovial tone vanished, replaced by hurried apologies and nervous laughter. Alara peered around the corner of the house. Blackwood stood tall, his face unreadable, but his posture radiating a quiet menace that silenced the salesman effectively. The man quickly changed the subject, his eyes darting nervously. Alara retreated back inside, her hands shaking. He had defended her, not with grand pronouncements, but with the sheer weight of his presence and authority. He had shut down the ugly talk not just for her sake, but because it was a violation of something he would not tolerate on his land. It was a different kind of protection than sheltering her from rustlers. It was a defense of her dignity, quiet and powerful. Later that day, Blackwood came into the kitchen while Alara was working. He paused, watching her for a moment. "That man," he said, his voice low. "He had no right to speak that way." Alara looked up, meeting his gaze. "No, sir," she agreed quietly. The memory of the auction, of being reduced to gossip and speculation, was sharp. "You're not that," he said, gesturing vaguely, his struggle for words noticeable for a man so decisive in action. "You're necessary here. You have a place." It wasn't an apology for buying her, or an offer of release. It was an affirmation of her value, not as property to be ogled, but as a person who contributed, who belonged in the functional ecosystem of his ranch. It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging her as an individual with worth beyond her purchased labor. Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest, unexpected and profound. It wasn't freedom, but it was recognition. It was dignity. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady. She looked him directly in the eye. "I appreciate that." He held her gaze for a moment longer than usual, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Then he gave his customary nod and turned to leave the room. The spring roundup came and went, a blur of hard work and long days. Alara worked alongside the cook, preparing enormous quantities of food, ensuring the men were fed and ready for the grueling task of gathering and branding cattle. She felt a part of the effort, her labor essential to the success of the ranch. She was no longer just surviving. She was contributing, building, enduring. As summer arrived, the land around the ranch turned lush and green. Alara's small garden thrived, providing fresh vegetables for the table. She spent hours tending it, finding solace and satisfaction in the feel of the soil and the growth of living things. One hot afternoon, Blackwood found her working in the garden, sweat beading on her brow, her hands covered in dirt. He stopped near the fence, watching her. "Garden's doing well," he commented. "Yes, sir. It's good soil here." He leaned against the fence post. "You didn't have to stay." Alara paused her work, looking up at him, surprised by the statement. The auction, the purchase, it had felt very much like she had to stay. "You could have left," he clarified, his gaze distant, looking out over the valley. "Gone somewhere else. After things settled." He was offering her a choice, retroactively, acknowledging that the circumstances of her arrival were not the circumstances of her continued presence. She hadn't been locked in, physically restrained. She had stayed because there was nowhere else to go, yes, but also because she had found a strange kind of security here, a purpose. "Where would I have gone?" she asked softly, turning back to her weeding. "Alone? With nothing?" He was silent for a moment. "The town. They wouldn't have been kind." "No," she agreed, the memory a bitter taste. You bought me. You gave me a place." He shifted, pushing off the fence. "I bought you, out of there." He didn't say to hear, just out of there. It was a subtle but significant distinction. He hadn't bought her for himself, but away from that fate. That was the implication. His motive, finally articulated, was simpler and more complex than she had imagined. It wasn't ownership he had sought, but intervention. He walked towards her, stopping at the edge of the garden plot. He looked down at the plants, then at her dirt-stained hands. "You've made this place better," he said quietly. "The house, the garden." It was high praise, delivered in his understated way. It wasn't about the monetary value of her work, but the intrinsic value of her presence, her care. Alara stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She met his gaze, feeling a sense of equality that transcended their circumstances. "I needed a place," she said simply, "and you provided it. The work, it gives a purpose." He nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. It wasn't a romantic moment, not one of yearning or affection. It was something deeper, a shared understanding of need, of survival, of finding purpose in a harsh world. He turned then, looking out at his vast land, stretching towards the mountains. "It's a hard life," he said, more to himself than to her. "Out here. Takes resilience." Alara looked out at the same landscape, the endless sky, the rugged hills. It was a hard life, yes, but it was also beautiful, vast, and honest in its demands, and she had found her place within it. She had come to this land a broken, terrified girl, sold like an animal on an auction block. She had been stripped of everything, her home, her family, her very name reduced to a price. But in the quiet, demanding solitude of the Blackwood Ranch, under the tacit protection of the stoic man who had bought her, she had found something unexpected. She had found work that gave her hands purpose, a routine that grounded her days, a silence that allowed her to find her own voice within. She had found respect, not given freely, but earned through quiet competence and unwavering resilience. Silas Blackwood had bought her from the auction, not for profit or for cruelty, but from something else entirely, perhaps a flicker of conscience, a silent rejection of the ugliness he witnessed. He had given her shelter, sustenance, and the chance to work, without expectation beyond her labor. And in return, Alara had brought order to his home, care to his small piece of cultivated land, and a quiet strength that complemented his own. Their relationship was unconventional, born of stark necessity and a desperate act. She was not a wife, not a servant in the traditional sense, not truly free in the eyes of the law that had allowed her to be sold. But she was not a possession either, not anymore. She was a woman who had faced the worst the world could offer and had not only survived, but had found her strength, her dignity, and a place to stand. The vast, silent landscape of the Blackwood Ranch was her crucible, and she had emerged from it, not unbroken, but profoundly, resiliently whole. She had been sold to the highest bidder, yes, but the true transaction had been the one between her own fear and her burgeoning strength. A price paid in hardship and quiet endurance, leading her not to bondage, but to a fierce, hard-won independence within the boundaries of her new life. The cattle baron had paid $100 to set her free from one fate, and in his silent world, she had begun the work of setting herself free in every other way that mattered.